Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep Book Talk. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council. So excited for our first book talk of the year for something so important and welcoming back to the Doorstep Kristina Lunz, co-founder and co-CEO of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, also author of today's book talk. The future of foreign policy is feminist. As you can see, Kristina, I have delved deep into this. I know last March was when you were here with us speaking about feminist foreign policy for Women's History Month. We were excited by the publication of your book in German and invited you back when it came out in English. And so I encourage all of our audience today to go out and buy this book. It is, I think, going to be on the reading list of every international relation and diplomacy class, or it should be. Nick and I are graduates of the School of Foreign Service, and I am writing to the dean right now. I think everybody should read about this because it really reframes how we think about international relations, how we think about global relations, how we think about human relations. And I'm so excited to have you here with us today to talk about the book and to also, I think, reintroduce feminist foreign policy to our audience who may not be as familiar. So welcome to our audience from wherever you're tuning in, or if you're watching this in playback. We welcome your questions live today and then online after the podcast. What I want to say to our audience live is that you can put your questions in the chat and we will take them in the second half of our talk. So we're going to kind of grease the wheels a little bit and then get going and look forward to hearing from you all. So getting back to you, Kristina, how have you been since last March? The world is such a different place. We said that last March, and yet it has further imploded, I think, personally, propelling the need for this new narrative that you talk about in your book, Feminist Foreign Policy. And so for our audience, could you just define it broadly, and then we'll kind of hone in to more specifics, but just so people know how we are looking at the world through your book in this conversation and in the world today.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Tatiana, Nikolas, I am so happy to be back. Thank you for having me again. It is wild times. It is tough times indeed. Right now, my days are actually occupied with something I might be talking about later. It is very much about feminist foreign policy, about legislation, which, from a feminist perspective, a couple of things are going wrong, and why I mobilized over 100 well-known, influential celebrity women here in Germany to pressure the German justice minister. But we might want to go back to this in a second, but it will actually be a great example of feminist foreign policy and a feminist lens on foreign and security policy. So, but maybe for the overview, for the meta level first, feminist foreign policy is an approach, is the attempt to do foreign and security policy fundamentally differently by placing human security and human rights at the core, at the center of foreign policy making, and having a feminist lens. A feminist lens means that we look at relations, institutions, dynamics from a power perspective. We look at how ministries spend money, who they give priority when it comes to accepting advocacy work from different players. It's about feminist foreign policy advocates for more spending on international cooperation, for human rights, for feminist organizations, human rights organizations, for defending, for human rights defenders. And feminist foreign policy, just like all feminist approaches in society, well, let's put it this way, the feminist movement is about 200, 250 years old. And in those 200, 250 years, feminists, predominantly women, but not only at all, they have tried to rethink the world in a way that it works for everyone in a way that freedom and security is guaranteed for everyone, because currently it's not. That is feminist foreign policy.
Good. So I hope that kind of inspires people to ask further questions. And I think I want to point out in your book, you lay out a great framework. In my book, page 170, the 5 questions to ask for a feminist foreign policy. I love that frame as a potential frame for our discussion today. But before we get there, one of the things that strikes me about feminist foreign policy is that it is very personal, right? It is not just this, supranational or national policy. It really comes down to the local level. And you talk a lot about in your book on how this impacts domestic policy and how it impacts what we talk about here, the doorstep. And I want to start with a little bit about your introduction to feminist foreign policy, because actually in the book, you put a lot of your personal story in it. And I think that's really inspiring, and I hope to inspire our audience with it. And so I wonder if you'd be comfortable sharing your story and how you came to feminist foreign policy.
Thank you for asking this. So I come from a wonderful working class background in a tiny village of 80 people in the south of Germany. And growing up on the one hand was wonderful. On the other hand, growing up with a twin brother, I soon realized that even here in Germany, and so many people think Germany is so progressive, which it's not, it's very conservative. Growing up with a twin brother, it became very visible to me early on that there are different expectations and towards boys and girls, and freedoms guaranteed towards boys and girls. And I'm saying this from a very privileged position, globally speaking. So went to university at some point, and then in international contexts, I studied in the UK for quite a bit. I came acquainted with the feminist discourse, feminist literature, and I became very angry very, very quickly. I read about the fact that whenever in history when we objectified a group of people, and objectification can happen, for example, through sexualizing them, that leads to dehumanization. And dehumanization always leads to an increased level of violence towards a certain group of people. So, and then at the same time, I went home for summer break, and I, in a supermarket, I saw Europe's biggest newspaper lying in front of me, and it asked its readers on the front page to rate Germany's most beautiful cleavage. And it had the pictures of very successful, well-known German women. And I was so angry because I thought, we know that in Germany, every day a man tries to kill his partner or ex-partner, and every third day he succeeds. We know that every second woman has experience with serious sexual harassment, and every third with a more stronger form of sexualized violence. We know all of this. We know that there's this ubiquity of male violence in our society that is which has like a core function in our societies. So, and then at the same time, we keep sexualizing and objectifying and belittling women wherever we go, and in all media. So I started this campaign out of naivety against Europe's biggest newspaper. It was my first experience with having an impact that has implications for bigger group in society, and it was also my first experience with like massive online violence, and this online violence, like the rape threats and the insults and the threats against my family and all of that, which I kept receiving over weeks. Again, first it almost managed to silence me, which is the intention of online violence towards women. But then I understood this function of like how patriarchy also works very hard to keep those women who question patriarchal structures quiet. So I was not only angry, but also determined. Out of this, I kept studying. I started working internationally in Colombia and Bogota for a little bit during late 2016, the time of the peace referendum between the FARC and the Colombian government. And when the referendum was first rejected by just by a margin by the Colombian population electorate, we went on the street like marching and protesting every day with the feminist organization that I worked for. And to me, looking back, it was the first experience of how anti-feminist, anti-gender, anti-democratic actors they how there's this link between anti-democratic and anti-feminist ideas. From after that, I worked for a few years at the UN, at UNDP, New York, and in Myanmar. In Myanmar, during the time of the height of the genocide of the Burmese military against the Muslim minority of the Rohingya, and experiencing all of that. And I was in New York. I arrived the day of the inauguration of Donald Trump, and experiencing all of this and having kind of some feminist knowledge, and also knowing about great women, for example, like Margot Wallström, the former Swedish foreign minister, who introduced feminist foreign policy in her country in 2014, that kind of inspired this wish I had to start my own organization on feminist foreign policy, which I co-founded in 2018, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. And then a few years later, I wrote the book about feminist foreign policy.
I do want to get to the example you alluded to in the beginning, your current work on legislation. But I want to maybe just go into a little bit more about what governments need to do to think about feminist foreign policy. You mentioned in your book from the time of the first publication in German, there were 7 countries. Sweden was the first, and then kind of backtracked a little bit. But there were 7 at the time of the first publication, and when this particular translation came out, there were 11. I'm wondering where we are in the world, and how countries need to be thinking about this in a time, especially when war is the only thing that's being talked about.
Yeah. So indeed, over the past few years, since 2014, there has been this like small but very powerful movement towards more feminist foreign policies, and it's still there. But with the current international global state that we're in, of course, there are more challenges here as well. So officially, we have 14 countries that have a feminist foreign policy. But, then again, later last year, there were, for example, elections in the Netherlands, and there were elections in Argentina, and there were changes. So for some countries, we do not know as of yet how this will impact the feminist foreign policies. But I guess I'm trying to say that last year was a year of big gains for feminist foreign policy. And at the same time, also, it was, challenges increased as well. Speaking of gains, for example, during the UN General Assembly week last September in New York, at the UN, the very first big high-level meeting on feminist foreign policy took place. So we had foreign ministers from several countries, including Germany, but also from the Netherlands, and several other countries, speak and pledge certain commitments and ideas and principles with regards to feminist foreign policy. So we have that. We have very, very active civil society around the world working on feminist foreign policy. Here in Europe, there are many organizations working on it. In the US, there are strong organizations, especially, for example, the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, and the International Center for Research on Women, and many more. And in Latin America, there's a very strong, they have very strong feminist movement anyways, but they're also excellent on feminist foreign policy NGOs there. And then last year, another great, a group, a consortium, not yet an NGO, but feminist experts are organizing on African feminist informed policies. So we have these incredible experts all over all over the globe. And luckily, we are all collaborating and kind of trying to pull the right strings for more countries to take on a feminist approach, which would include, for example, increasing spending on human rights, increasing spending on international collaboration, increasing spending for feminist civil society. It includes stronger arms export control. It includes rethinking narratives around deterrence, for example. It includes wanting to strengthen the international international law framework. It includes coming together to fight back the increasing anti-feminist, anti-gender, authoritarian movement. Yeah.
When you were speaking about spending, it reminded me of the saying, "Show me your budget and I'll tell you your strategy," which I think gets at a heart of what you've written in the book and what you've been working for, that it's not just simply a matter of representation, it's a matter of changing institutional priorities, changing bureaucracies, changing the lists of what organizations in government are measured by. And so I wanted to touch on that a bit more because, historically, whether it was Queen Victoria or Empress Catherine the Great or Margaret Thatcher or Indira Gandhi, you might have had women in power, but I don't think you would necessarily say they had a feminist foreign policy in their time, in their tenures. Uh, how do you see this effort of institutional transformation? In other words, how do you get a foreign ministry, a defense ministry, to put human security at the center? And what does that begin to look like beyond just lip service to, yes, we should pay attention to these issues? I mean, how do you see that process of transformation occurring?
Yeah, it's a mammoth task, definitely. So I tried to outline it in the book and kind of show the different areas you really need to tackle. It starts with taking on the narratives that are being taught in international relations theory, for example, like this big focus on the so-called realist paradigm, which stipulates that because we have no supranational government, that all countries are in anarchy, and from that, the realists' conclusion is that they're all in competition towards each other. So they all want to get more arms, they want to be a military more powerful, and these narratives and these conclusions that are drawn from they inform what institutions we build and what, yeah, as you said, what we spend money on. For the, I don't know, is it the third or fourth time in a row, international global military spending has increased. Then it started increasing during the pandemic, during a time when there was not enough money for hospital beds and to pay doctors and nurses. But millions of US dollars was spent on the missing the word, on the modernization of nuclear arsenals, for example. We right in the beginning of the book, I am quoting or mentioning one of these kind of comparisons of spending, like the international global military spending now stands at a bit more than 2 trillion US dollars. And at the same time, the international community is spending a fraction of this money, less, what am I quoting, less than 0.4, around 0.4% of that on UN peacekeeping, for example. Like if we look at those those huge differences, it's just, I mean, no one actually has to wonder why we're living in an international violent state, because the whole international architecture is set up to fight wars and to inflict violence on other people. So this institutional change, we need to start changing narratives, because this then will inform institutions. We need to get the strategies right and the priorities and the budgets. But also, for example, here at the foreign ministry in Berlin. So Germany announced a feminist foreign policy in March last year. And on paper, they have an excellent strategy. They call them the feminist foreign policy guidelines. And within the ministry, they changed some structures. They have now like a really tiny department on feminist foreign policy. They have a new section department on diversity. They're trying to mainstream feminist foreign policy, but it's not, of course, it's not this institutional transformation and change that would be needed to have the resources to produce, for example, human rights reports for every country that is informed from a feminist perspective, that really takes into account the situation of women, of marginalized people, of LGBTQI communities. We still have miserable record of German arms exports. Germany is exporting to countries that hugely violate human rights, and those reports, those arms export, those assessments to understand which countries should receive arms from Germany, they often do not include human rights considerations, which we've looked into a few years back here at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy for our research on the impact of German weapons on sexualized violence in Latin America. So we need this holistic change, like this comprehensive change towards a more feminist foreign policy. It would need to change representation and budgets and in departments and narratives. It's a mammoth task.
And I want to go back to Nick. You said it's not about representation, or maybe I
Or
think
that it's insufficient, right? That it's
well,
not enough just to say we have X amount of women if the structures and the bureaucratic incentives are such to lead you in a different,
I'm gonna counter with it is important to have women in positions of power with voices that can make those changes. Representation is everything. And I don't know, Kristina, maybe you can navigate this discussion, but I'm struck by, particularly in your book, your discussion of how women were not allowed to be diplomats, right? That story, as a graduate of the School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University, who I never, when I applied and thought I would be the first ambassador to Ukraine, when it was independent, like that was my dream goal. That's how old I am. Like back when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, like it never occurred to me to think that I couldn't be. So it really didn't. And reading your narrative, your history about how hard it was for women to be accepted in the diplomatic corps and still continue to be in industrialized global North countries. Never mind, by the way, we haven't touched on the Middle East here, right? So, representation is everything, I think. So I love the history that you present in international relations and diplomacy. Maybe you can touch on that and its impact, because its corollary for me in your book is how when women are part of the peace process, it becomes more lasting. I mean, and you quote various statistics about how it becomes more lasting. So we have to have the women there in order to make lasting change. And right now, again, going back to, in a world that's imploding, I look at my television screen and there are no women negotiating a settlement in Israel and Palestine that I see. Maybe there's somebody behind the scenes. Inform me. Audience, inform me. But on screen, I'm only seeing what you talk about in your headline, old white men or, old privileged men or, so representation, Kristina, how do we get there? And what do you think about some of these comments?
I guess you're both right. So representation, a fair representation, according to the size of a certain group in society, that's about justice and fairness. So from a feminist perspective, there's no question around the fact that women need to be represented a bit more than 50% in all positions of power, and that's never anything I would find arguments for, because as a feminist, I'm relying on profound ideas of justice, and that is what representative justice is about. And as you rightly said, Jana, it was not that only that women were not allowed to be diplomats until recently in Germany, both West and East Germany, until the late 40s. But then it was only in the 90s that women, a bit more than a handful, started to be in positions of like ambassadors or more leading diplomatic positions. In the UK, it was not until the 70s that they had the choice to be diplomats and wives. There was the so-called marriage bar in place. But then also there's this history, which I'm also discussing in the book about, and you just mentioned it, about peace processes. So feminist foreign policy as a concept, or kind of the idea to rethink the international global order from a feminist perspective, that goes back to at least 1915, when during the First World War in The Hague in the Netherlands, more than 1,200 women feminists, many suffragettes, they gathered to discuss the state of affairs and demand an end to the First World War and demilitarization, but a lot more. They published 20 resolutions, which included peace education, of course, women's suffrage. Most women were not allowed to vote at that time. It included the dismantling of the military-industrial complex, because already back then, the feminists, the women, they said that as long as producing arms and exporting and selling weapons is so financially beneficial, there will of course be no end to wars, because so many people benefit from the wars that are being fought around the globe, and they have doubled in the last 10 years, from roughly 30 to 60. So all these resolutions which the women published, it was really about rethinking the international order. They were some of the first to call for an international court of arbitration. They demanded something like the League of Nations, which then became the League of Nations, and then the United Nations. And it was the same women which were not then a few years later at the Paris Peace Conference, which were not allowed to attend the Paris Peace Conference, because only men, I think I'm mentioning one Chinese, I think, delegate was allowed to attend, but there was pretty much no woman allowed, and no pacifists. And men were worried that these women were too pacifist to attend a peace conference. And it's the figures are not that much. They're a little bit better, but what are the latest numbers by UN Women and Brookings? I think they have the best numbers. That around 10% of attendees of peace processes are women, and mediators roughly the same number, signatories a little bit less. So we're far off from fair representation there, and we know that peace lasts longer if we have the more women we have involved. And that's not because women are more peaceful or women are more empathetic or anything. It's because a time of a peace process, a peace conference, a mediation process is the time when the kind of the future of a society, of a country, is being negotiated, and when it's kind of supposed to be rebuilt. And if you're not including the needs, the security needs of all people involved in the society, how is this supposed to be stable?
No, I think that's a critical point, and it comes back to this notion of putting human security at the center. And just to come back, Tatiana, to emphasize your point on representation, Kristina, when you were talking about the peace activists and the feminists gathered in The Hague a century ago, and talking about the financial incentives, it does seem that representation needs to be not only in government, but just as much in business. that it's not a matter of simply increasing representation in foreign ministries and defense ministries and intelligence agencies, but also in boardrooms and corporate suites, if a feminist foreign policy narrative is to gain traction. So I think that that's important to emphasize there. If I could just to come back again to this, this point about durable peace. So we've seen peace processes in the Middle East that have not really worked to generate lasting peace. We've seen conflict resolution efforts in many parts of the world that don't seem to put, they seem, as you said, to focus on the military aspects, demilitarizing or creating security zones, but not really putting human security at the center, which would include certainly, dealing with violence against women, violence against children, the things that prevent sort of normal, safe existence. And again, coming back to, is this the chicken and egg problem? If we have more women at these events, does that move the needle? Do we need, or what has to happen? Is it a question of, that governments and more governments just simply have to say these are the priorities that we're going to put forward, and the metrics question, which is we're going to measure a success not by military means. We're going to look at human security indexes. We're going to look at the well-being of a population. I'm just trying to get at this idea of how do we make this shift when we have such entrenched bureaucracies, and we just really have such entrenched, as you said, narratives that really privilege conflict and prevailing in conflict as the measure for success or failure in foreign policy. That you win or lose wars rather than you improved life for people. So from the book, the conclusions that you have in it, the pathway forward, maybe for the audience of concrete recommendations for how we can begin to advance this agenda moving forward.
A couple of thoughts to what you just said. So one point I forgot to say before, you were of course also right when you said that it's not sufficient to have more women in certain positions. So this is why I think I said I agree with both of you, because on the one hand, fair representation, that has to be a must, which is non-negotiable. And at the same time, it is true that only because we have, for example, a woman in a certain position doesn't mean that she's doing feminist work. And feminist work means dismantling unjust structures, for example, patriarchal structures. So both is true. And so you alluded to violence against women and durable peace. And as you were saying this, I wanted to add to this an important piece of research done by, for example, Professor Valerie Hudson and her team, on how the most significant factor towards whether a country is peaceful within its own borders or towards other countries, that's the level of gender equality in a country and the level of violence against women. So you can say that the more patriarchal a country is, the more likely that country will go to war, the more likely this country will violate international law. And so ultimately, and Tatiana, you alluded to it in the beginning, the book and feminist foreign policy is so personal because the international state of affairs and how violent it is and how many wars we are fighting is a direct extension of the ubiquity, normalization, and impunity of male violence. This is ultimately what it's about. So if we as countries and societies around the world do not manage to finally at some point get male violence kind of under control, we will not see an end wars and conflicts globally. So durable peace is a function of how successful countries are to keep male aggression in check, really. And so maybe it's that's a good point now to mention what I started with in the beginning of the talk. What's kind of the activist or campaigning work that I'm currently leading here in Germany, and how this is linked to feminist foreign policy. So in yesterday, so I drafted an open letter towards the justice minister here in Germany. And it was signed by more than 100 very, very well-known women from the German public, from politics and culture and the business world, including different MPs from different parties as well. Because at the EU in 2022, a piece by the Commission, a piece of legislation was proposed on comprehensively combating violence against women. It's the very first piece that is introduced into the legislative process at the EU on comprehensively combating violence against women, digitally, but also in so-called real life. But this is blocked by mainly two countries, and that is France and Germany. It's two countries that officially have a feminist foreign policy, and they're both blocking it. In person, it's the German justice minister blocking it. So he's quoting concerns about whether the EU has the competence to regulate these kind of crimes. There are a lot of, and here I'm lacking a word, there are lots of pieces of paper written about kind of proving him wrong by lawyers and coalitions of lawyers and human rights organizations. But he is still blocking, and he's from a party which in the past has attracted attention for doing unfeminist, anti-feminist policies. So this is like effort, and it's currently all over the media in Germany, and to move him, to ask him to stop this blockade. Because what it's ultimately about is it's about better protecting millions of women across the whole EU. This piece of legislation, if adopted, would harmonize laws on violence against women across the EU, for example, with regards to rape. So no means no, and consent would be the basis of judging rape in court. But he's blocking it, and that is a perfect example of feminist policies. Like, this has to be accepted from a feminist perspective, because our societies are still functioning in a way that male violence, in most cases, there's no punishment for male violence, but there's huge impunity. In Germany, roughly only 5 to 10% of all rape cases are reported, and of all rape cases, roughly only 1% are prosecuted. So, and this is part tricky. So now we need to find tools and ways to change these structures. And EU legislation, and this then becomes foreign policy, because it's so many countries coming together and trying to make this legislation, would be one way to make societies less patriarchal, to better protect women from male violence. And this then ultimately contributes to a more peaceful world on a global scale.
Just as you were saying that, and you've been talking about narratives in foreign policy and teaching foreign policy, I think that's a great metric that you've introduced, which is, I think many people are familiar with democratic peace theory, that democracies don't go to war. There's great capitalist peace theory, that countries that trade together don't go to war. But maybe the actual metric is societies that have less violence against women at home are less likely to go to war. And as you were saying that, just thinking about the trajectory in Russia over the past 30 years, where women's representation in government has really fallen. Women's position in the economy and business. There used to be a party in Russia called the Women of Russia that ran on feminist platforms, which has disappeared from the political infrastructure. And then that really gets you thinking about that we can perhaps we can measure this and then see perhaps a direct correlation to a willingness to employ force abroad when you have these metrics, patriarchal metrics, plus the violence against women metrics. And so I think, as you were saying before, and Tatiana, as you were noting, when we teach this to students, this is still not, I think, at the top of the agenda. People either think in terms of realism, power, they think in terms of democratic peace, but thinking then and saying the violence against women peace or war thesis, definitely. And then when we look at other conflict zones around the world, I think we see this relationship. And as you noted, even in the industrial democracies, where these issues may not be addressed at the doorstep level, that then have an impact on how a country positions itself overseas. So no, I think that's a extremely important conclusion.
Yeah, and so there's some questions in the chat. I want to make sure that we address those, and please send them in. We're in our second half of the conversation. We want to make sure we include our audience in the conversation. So I'm going to read out Edgar Pozo's question. Do you think that despite prioritizing women's empowerment, climate change, and marginalized groups, the world has a major issue with global security dependency and inner conflicts, a delicate situation at a major scale in the current world, taking into account that international cooperation is key for change and making possible clear changes? Could the feminist foreign policy ensure whether the critical international politics or reinforce gender gaps? So I guess the question is, what really is the clear goal of feminist foreign policy if we were to say to kind of the world leaders today, right? Like, where do we go from today on? Is how I'm interpreting your question, Edgar.
So the example of Russia was just mentioned. In my book, I have this one chapter about feminist foreign policy in the times of conflict, in the times of war, because so many people always say, okay, it's nice to have, but we don't have time for this. We have like major crises, wars and conflict. And I'm arguing that it's the most urgent time when we need changes and when we need feminist foreign policy, and nevertheless, and at the same time, I mean, feminist foreign policy was kind of created during time of war in 1915, so that argument is really does not go anywhere. So and in this chapter, I'm looking at Russia and Ukraine, for example, and I'm arguing that feminist foreign policy is really good at distinguishing between the short, medium, and long term. And this distinction between short, medium, and long term I apply to Iran in this one chapter, but also to Russia and Ukraine. And what we can understand and learn when we, for example, look at Russia is that for not only since 2014, when the invasion on the Crimea, when the invasion started on Crimea, but for many years, the LGBTQI movement, women and women's rights, they have faced so many attacks. For example, the law on domestic violence was reversed, again, making it legal again. You can legally beat your wife in Russia, and it's not and it's and then at the same time, we've seen the attacks on the feminist movement with the vilification. The LGBTQI community now is at like huge danger because they have only very recently been put more on the margins again. And this has been happening for so many years, and human rights organizations, feminist organizations, LGBTQI rights organizations, they have been they've been raising the alarm for so many years, because it's pretty much always the same when we look around the world. Authoritarian or more authoritarian regimes or more autocratic regimes, they start with the attack on the human rights and marginalized groups in their communities, in their society. So from a feminist perspective, first of all, we need to learn from the past, what we did wrong there, and how a early warning system includes these voices, and when they raise the alarm. We also, in the short term, feminist foreign policy can address, for example, women, and in the Ukraine it was mainly women, who are fleeing their country. They are facing huge danger of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, for example. It also includes gender-specific humanitarian assistance, a short-term focus of feminist foreign policy. It includes looking at the fact that, I mean, sexualized violence and documenting sexualized violence in conflict and rape as a weapon of war, and addressing this. And then until recently, before we had the new government in Poland, which will hopefully change the legislation on abortion, but when the war started, Poland, and many women fled to Poland, there was pretty much a complete ban on abortion. So what happens to the Ukrainian women raped by soldiers, maybe fleeing to the Ukraine, to Poland? These are all short-term aspects that can be looked at. But in the medium and long term, a feminist foreign policy, so in the medium term, we need feminist interventions, and in the long term, we need feminist transformation. And feminist transformation in the long term means building towards a world where it will no longer be possible that a mass murderer, a dictator like Putin, is in possession of nuclear weapons. So it must look at the big structures. It must look at the rise of authoritarianism and how we can stop this. It must look at the proliferation of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. It must look at structures of power abuse. And feminist foreign policy, if it wants to be successful, must address all of that, short, medium, long term. So I guess to that question, I guess that is my response to the question. We need to be very diligent and be smart in all these different time spans.
I want to mention one of the pleasures of reading your book were all the shout outs you did to women who you work with, who have inspired you. Please, we are talking today about Kristina Lunz about the future of foreign policy as feminist, and I don't know how many there are, but I really enjoyed at the end of every chapter there are these vignettes about power women. I'm going to call them power women. One of our audience members calls out Hudson, and Sex in the World Peace argues for a democratic peace theory. We have another shout out to the Women, Peace and Security Index developed by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. But I wanted to say that as part of these vignettes, one of them you talk about is this book called Invisible Women. And I taught a class called Reporting Gender, and I use that text because it really talks about patriarchy and patriarchal systems, which we've alluded to this entire conversation. But I kind of, just want to stress that this is what we're living in today. And I think people need to talk about it. We have some things going on, kind of a huge election in the United States. And I don't think these issues are being addressed. We have some candidates claiming that the United States is not a racist country, kind of completely not even thinking about our history and the history of colonization and patriarchy. And that's one of the things that your book really, really highlights. And I want to talk about kind of these systems and how you come up against them, and maybe strategies for those who want to pursue a new narrative in feminist foreign policy. How do you kind of work within patriarchal systems? Because you give some examples of working within and outside the system. And I think that might be inspirational for some people listening.
Yes. I love the question, and I respond to it in a second. Before that, because you mentioned the upcoming elections in the US, and a feminist approach to some part with regards to the US elections, which, well, from a German perspective, I can say that I'm massively worried about, and I think the whole world is worried about. I personally, I'm so worried about that. I mean, I don't know if on a big German weekly magazine, the front page talked about a possible Trump dictatorship. So this is what we're really worried about when it comes to the elections coming up. And from a feminist perspective, I can only hope that those in the Foreign Office and mainly in the Foreign Office here in Germany, who are somehow preparing for different scenarios, that they also thinking about the implications for women's and marginalized groups' rights. I think we have to, if Trump is elected, one of the first things he might do is completely ban abortion on all possible levels. And I mean, this is what he did after last election. One of the first decisions, executive orders, was on the global gag rule, for example. And so, there's huge worries about your upcoming elections. But your question was about how to work within and outside the system. So my approach towards change and how my organization, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, is doing it is exactly what you mentioned. It's about trying to change from the inside by working with those within institutions that we share visions and principles with, but also addressing and doing advocacy work from the outside. The example that I mentioned just before on the piece of women's rights legislation, the work that we're currently doing is doing both. Like, we have created this really huge media attention on the issue, and we're working we're talking to influential MPs from that party and other parties, and to cabinet members, and trying to do both. And that is only possible because we've built trust-based relationships with many actors that we can now talk to, and also because we've built a reputation which allows us to do such things as public facing open letters and the involvement of very influential public actors. So, and I think this will lead to most success if you manage to do this. And the Munich Security Conference, for example, is coming up in 3 weeks' time, 2.5. And we'll be hosting a big feminist women's only dinner again. And we've been doing events on feminist foreign policy at the Munich Security Conference since 2020. We were the first organization that has ever brought feminist foreign policy to the Munich Security Conference. And since we've been doing it, we've also been criticized by feminist organizations for being at a space that traditionally has been, still is, very militaristic. There are strong links between the Munich Security Conference and arms dealers and arms manufacturers. And the main security concept is definitely one of militarized security instead of human security. But we will go back, and we will try to bring back the topic of feminist foreign policy and human rights and human security, and we're trying to bring our narratives to the security conference. I understand if some do not want to do it and rather stay out of certain spaces, but for me, this is how I think changes, that this is the most efficient way to create change.
We want to thank you so much for joining us today and wish you much luck at the Munich Security Conference. Kristina Lunz, co-founder, co-CEO for the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, author of The Future of Foreign Policy is Feminist, a book that will be read in every single classroom in the next few years.
Hope so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me again.